Police were dispatched to a mansion at 431 Hillside Avenue in Westfield, New Jersey, on the night of December 7, 1971, by neighbors who for a month had seen no activity in or around the home. Officers were told that the lights had been on 24/7, and they were burning out one by one from being on so long. The neighbors feared something was terribly wrong. Police found an unlocked window and entered the home. Searching the house with their flashlights, they found the mansion strangely cold. They heard eerie classical music, which one officer said sounded like a funeral. They made their way into the ballroom, where they came across a grisly scene, one that they would never forget. Lying on the floor, covered with sleeping bags, were 4 bodies. As they pulled the sleeping bags away, they saw that they were 3 teenagers and an adult woman. They had all been shot in the back of the head at close range. As the search continued, another victim was found dead in the 3rd floor hallway. The Westfield mansion belonged to a 46-year-old accountant named John Emil List. Police would quickly identify the bodies as that of Helen List, John's wife, and his children, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John Jr., and 13-year-old Frederick. John List was not among the bodies. Officers found a large blood trail going from the kitchen to the ballroom. The mansion, known as Breeze Knoll, was now the scene of a brutal crime. It appeared that all but one of the victims had been shot in the kitchen, and the bodies were then dragged into the ballroom and covered with sleeping bags. But where was John List? Was he a victim, or was he the killer? Authorities wouldn't be asking that question for long. In John's study, they found a letter on the desk, addressed to the local Lutheran church pastor. In this letter, John List confessed to slaughtering his entire family and then tried to justify and explain it. The letter was dated November 9, 1971, meaning the now suspected mass murderer, John List, had a 1-month head start. 2 days after the crime scene at Breeze Knoll was discovered, police found John List's car abandoned at JFK Airport in New York City. Inside was a parking voucher stamped for November 10th, but there were no records of List ever boarding a plane. Westfield authorities issued a nationwide first-degree murder warrant for John Emil List. FBI offices in every state received the alert. Meanwhile, back in Westfield, police were putting together a timeline. List's neighbors would tell investigators that he was not sociable, and it didn't appear that he had any friends. They would say that List was basically a recluse who often mowed his grass wearing a business suit and tie. So why did John List execute his entire family? As police dug deeper into John List's life, they found that he had lost his accounting job at a local bank some time ago. As List was the family breadwinner and with no income, the bills started to pile up. But strangely, List didn't even try to get another job. Instead, he followed his usual routine of getting up early, getting dressed for work, and leaving the house at the same time every day. But instead of going to work, he would go to the train station and spend the day there reading newspapers, then arrive back home at his normal time, giving his family the illusion that he had been working at the bank all day. John List purchased Breeze Knoll, a 19-room mansion, in 1965 for $50,000, equivalent to over $400,000 today. He borrowed the money for the down payment from his mother, Elma, and in return, allowed her to move into the 3rd-floor attic apartment. By 1971, he had already taken out a second mortgage, and police would find out he had been dipping into his mother's bank accounts to cover the expenses while he was unemployed. On top of that, his relationship with his wife Helen was disintegrating. List also had growing concerns about his children, especially 16-year-old Patricia. She had taken up an interest in acting and was a member of her school's drama program. List was terrified that Patricia's participating in what he called show business would cause her to stray away from her faith and the Lutheran Church. John List had been raised in a strict Lutheran household, and he ran his household the same way. One evening, not long before the murders, John asked Helen and each of the children if they would prefer to be cremated or to be buried in the event of their deaths while the family ate at the dining table. This bothered Patricia, so much so that she told her drama teacher, Edwin Iliano, but he didn't take it very seriously. The autopsies confirmed the obvious. All had died from gunshot wounds to the back of the head, except two of the victims. John Jr. had multiple gunshots, while Elma had been shot in the forehead at point-blank range. In the letter found in the study, List said that the pistols he used to annihilate his family would be found in his desk. Sure enough, police recovered a 9mm semi-automatic and a Colt .22 revolver from his desk drawer. This daunting and detached letter was the first step in understanding John List and his motives. Dear Pastor Raywinkle, I am sorry to add this additional burden to your work. I know that what has been done is wrong. From all that I have been taught, and that any reasons that I might give will not make it right. But you are the one person that I know that, while not condoning this, might understand why I felt I needed to do this. 1. I wasn't earning nearly enough to support us. Everything I tried seemed to fall to pieces. True, we could have gone bankrupt and maybe gone on welfare. 2. But that brings me to my next point. Noting the type of location one would have to live in, plus the environment for the children, plus the effect of them knowing they were on welfare, was just more than they could, or should, endure. I know they were willing to cut back, but this involved a lot more than that. 3. With Pat being so determined to get into acting, I was also fearful as to what that might do to her being Christian. I'm sure it wouldn't have helped. 4. Also with Helen not going to church, I knew that this would harm the children eventually, and their attendance. I had continued to hope that she would begin to come to church soon, but when I mentioned to her that Mr. Judd said that he wanted to pay her an elder call, she just blew up, and she wanted her name taken off the church rolls. Again, this could only have an adverse result on the children's continued attendance. So that is the sum of it. If any one of these things had been the condition, we may have pulled through, but this was just too much. At least I'm certain they've all gone to heaven now. If things had gone on, who knows if this would have been the case? Of course, Mother got involved, because of course, what I did to my family would have been a tremendous shock to her at this age. Therefore, knowing that she is also a Christian, I felt it best that she be relieved of the troubles of this world that would have hit her. After it was all over, I said some prayers for them from the hymn book. That was the least I could do. Now for the final arrangements. Helen and the children have all agreed that they would prefer to be cremated. Please see to it that the costs are kept low. For Mother, she has a plot at the Frankenmuth Church Cemetery. Please contact Mr. Herman Sheckless, Route 4, Vassar, Michigan, 41768. He's married to a niece of Mother's and knows what arrangements are to be made. She always wanted Reverend Herman Zender of Bay City to preach the sermon, but he's not well. Also, I'm leaving some letters in your care. Please send them on and add whatever comments you feel are appropriate. The relationships are as follows: Mrs. Lydia Meyer, Mother's sister; Mrs. Eva Meyer, Helen's mother; and Jean Seifert, Helen's sister. Also, I don't know what will happen to the books and personal things, but to the extent possible, I'd like for them to be distributed as you see fit. Some books might go to the school or the church library. Originally, I planned this for November 1st, All Saints' Day, but travel arrangements were delayed. I thought it'd be an appropriate day for them to go to heaven. As for me, please let me be dropped from the congregation rolls. I leave myself in the hands of God's justice and mercy. I don't doubt that He is able to help us, but apparently He saw fit not to answer my prayers the way I hoped they would be answered. This made me think that, perhaps, it was for the best as far as the children's souls were concerned. I know that many will look at only the additional years that they could have lived, but if finally they were no longer Christians, what would be gained? Also, I'm sure, many will say, how could anyone do such a horrible thing? My only answer is, it isn't easy, and is only done after much thought. Pastor, Mrs. Norris may possibly be reached at 802 Pleasant Hill Drive, Elkin, home of her sister. One other thing. It may seem cowardly to have always shot from behind, but I didn't want any of them to know, even at the last second, that I had to do this to them. John got hurt more because he seemed to struggle longer. The rest were immediately out of pain. John didn't consciously feel anything either. Please remember me in your prayers. I will need them whether or not the government does its duty as it sees fit. I'm only concerned with making my peace with God, and of this I'm assured, because of Christ dying, even for me. P.S. Mother is in the hallway, in the attic, 3rd floor. She was too heavy for me to move. The following is what the Westfield Police and the FBI established as John List's timeline on the day of the murders. On the morning of November 9th, 1971, the List family awoke as usual and the children went off to school. As Helen sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast, John approached her from behind, held a pistol to the back of her head, and pulled the trigger. He then dragged her body off into the ballroom and placed a sleeping bag over it. He walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor apartment where he found his mother, Elma. He walked toward her, pointed the pistol at her forehead, and fired, killing her instantly. As mentioned in the confession letter, Elma was too heavy for John to carry down the stairs, so Elma remained where she fell until she was discovered. He then went downstairs, cleaned up the kitchen, left, and drove to the bank, where he withdrew all available funds from both his and his mother's accounts and closed them. He then went to the post office, where he stopped the mail delivery and sent out letters to the schools explaining that the children would be absent for the next few weeks while the family was out of town tending to a sick relative. He then returned to Breeze Knoll, made himself some lunch, and waited for the children to get home from school. Patricia arrived first, entering through the kitchen. John crept up behind her and shot her in the back of the head. Like her mother, she died instantly, and her body was dragged into the ballroom and covered. List again cleaned up the blood the best he could, and laid in wait once again. Frederick was next. Just like his sister, he was shot in the back of the head as he walked in the kitchen, and then taken to the ballroom and covered with a sleeping bag. After cleaning up the kitchen yet again, he decided not to wait for John Jr. to get home. Instead, he drove to the school where his son was playing a soccer game. As John watched, he would later say how it looked like John Jr. was having a great time. So after the game, List and his only surviving son hopped in the car and drove back to Breeze Knoll. As they walked into the house, John Jr. went in first as his father pulled a pistol from his coat pocket and shot his son in the back of the head. Only this time, it didn't kill him. John List would later tell authorities that his son was flailing about on the floor, so he kept shooting. When he was sure that his son was dead, John Jr. joined his mother and his siblings on the ballroom floor, covered with a sleeping bag. John Jr. was found to have a total of 10 gunshot wounds, leading investigators to believe that he had fought back. Now that the entire family had been massacred, John List made himself dinner, cleaned the kitchen yet again, and then went to bed. The next morning, List got up early and turned the thermostat down to 50 degrees, thinking that would slow the decomposition of the bodies. After turning on every light in the 19-room mansion, he put the radio on his favorite classical music station to make it look like someone was home. He then drove to JFK Airport in New York City with $2,000 from the closed-out bank accounts and got on a train to Denver. It was at this point that Robert Clark appeared and John List vanished. John List, now known as Robert Clark, with a Colorado state ID and social security card to prove it, took a job as a fry cook at a Holiday Inn outside Denver. He lived a very low-key existence, fully expecting the police to come knocking at any time. But as the years went on, and that didn't happen, Robert Clark slowly started to go back to his old life. He got an accounting job, dated, and later married a woman from the local Lutheran church, Dolores Miller. Meanwhile, back in Westfield, no one forgot about John List, least of all the police. Over the years, they would interview and re-interview the same people, trying to jog memories and to get any clues they might have overlooked or missed back in 1971. They got tips, but nothing ever panned out. In 1988, a new show called America's Most Wanted premiered on Fox Network. It was hosted by John Walsh, himself the victim of a tragedy when his young son Adam was murdered by the serial killer Otis O'Toole. The Westville police, who were running out of ideas on how to apprehend John List, saw this as a perfect vehicle to jumpstart the investigation. So they presented the case to Fox and were promptly turned down. The show's producers thought too much time had passed, and there was no way of giving an accurate description of what List may look like some 17 years after he was last seen, and they weren't even positive that John List was still alive. But he was very much alive. He had gotten comfortable enough in his new life as Robert Clark that he and his wife moved back to the East Coast, to Virginia. List still worked as an accountant and was a fan of America's Most Wanted. List would later say that he wondered if his story would ever make it on the show, and after nearly a year, it happened. On the May 21st, 1989 edition of the show, John List was its headlining case. The network decided to double down its efforts and hired forensic artist Frank Bender to make a bust using age progression to give an idea of what List may look like after 18 years of being a fugitive. List himself caught the tail end of the segment and would later say that he had no idea that age progression was even a thing. After the segment aired, tips poured into the call center, but one tip from Denver got the FBI's attention. Back in Colorado, Robert Clark's old neighbor, Wanda Flannery, had watched the America's Most Wanted segment. Flannery's daughter said that the similarities were shocking. He worked in accounting. He had a visible scar behind his ear. He went to the Lutheran church. And the bust featured on the program was a dead ringer. Bob Clark is John List. Flannery told the FBI that the guy they're looking for, John List, aka Robert Clark, and his wife Dolores had recently moved to Richmond, Virginia. Less than 2 weeks later, Robert Clark was approached by FBI agents outside of the Richmond accounting firm where he worked. An agent asked if he was Robert Clark, and the man said yes. The agent then asked if he was John Emil List, and the man said, "No, I'm Robert Clark." Robert Clark / John List was taken into custody, and his fingerprints matched those found at the 1971 crime scene, as well as John List's military records. He was extradited to New Jersey in 1989 and charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his trial, List testified at length on how the loss of his job, the family's financial ruin, and Helen's alleged alcoholism and syphilis drove him to where he only saw 2 choices: either go bankrupt and put the family on public assistance, or spare his family the embarrassment and humiliation by killing them and sending their souls to heaven. A court-appointed psychiatrist testified that John List suffered from OCD and felt that the welfare option was not acceptable since it went against his strict Lutheran upbringing, which taught that the husband / father protects and takes care of the family no matter what. On April 12, 1990, the jury convicted John List of all 5 counts of first-degree murder. At his sentencing, List told the judge that he felt he couldn't be held accountable for his actions in 1971 due to his mental state at the time. The judge was unmoved. He read the following statement before passing sentence. John Emil List is without remorse and without honor. After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John List Jr. to rise from the grave. He then imposed a sentence of 5 consecutive terms of life in prison. During his incarceration, John List gave interviews where he expressed some remorse for butchering his family. Connie Chung asked him why he had not taken his own life, and he said that he believed suicide would prevent him from going to heaven, where he hoped to one day be reunited with his family. John List died on March 21, 2008, at age 82, after serving 18 years of 5 consecutive life terms.